I thought I knew exactly what kind of evening it was going to be. The kind where the house smells of roasted chicken and old beeswax, where the parlor fills with something soft and half-forgotten from the keys of the old upright piano in the corner, where everything feels, for one quiet hour, entirely whole. I had no idea that the moment Rosa lifted her hands from those keys and padded down the hall to her room, the silence she left behind would swallow something monstrous, a secret that had been hiding inside the music all along, waiting for the notes to stop so it could finally breathe. She played for 43 minutes that Thursday evening. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on the mantel without meaning to, the way you sometimes track small, ordinary things when you sense, somewhere deep in your bones, that the ordinary is about to end. I was curled into the corner of the velvet sofa with a glass of Pinot Grigio that had gone warm in my hand, watching Rosa's thin shoulders sway above the bench, and I thought, this is enough. This life is enough. I had no idea that in the study behind me, separated only by a wall of old plaster and family photographs, my husband Mark was speaking in a voice too low to hear over the music, and that what he was saying would make everything I believed about my marriage, my home, and my own sanity crumble into something I could not name. My name is Clara Whitmore, Clara Ashford by marriage, though I had spent the last 3 years quietly resenting the paperwork that made it official. I was 34 years old that Thursday evening, and I lived in the house my grandmother left me, a wide, creaking Victorian on Heron Street, with a wraparound porch and a leaky skylight above the staircase, and a piano. No one but Rosa ever played anymore. My grandmother had bought that piano in 1962, and it had survived 3 generations of off-key Christmas carols, 2 basement floods, and a family divorce that split everyone into pieces that had only barely managed to find each other again by the time I inherited the deed. The house was mine, legally, entirely, unambiguously mine. My name alone was on the title. My grandmother had been very clear about that. She had sat across from me at the kitchen table 6 months before she died, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, and she had said, "Clara, this house stays in your name. Not his name, not their name, your name." I had smiled and told her she was being dramatic, and she had looked at me with those gray eyes of hers that always seemed to see 3 steps further than everyone else, and she had said very quietly, "I hope so, sweetheart. I genuinely hope so." I worked as a senior project manager at an architectural firm downtown, and the commute was 40 minutes each way, 5 days a week, a routine so deeply carved into my days that I had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the weight of a ring you've worn for years. Mark worked in corporate finance, though his hours had grown increasingly unpredictable over the past 18 months. Late nights explained away with phrases like quarterly reports and client dinners, and "It's just a busy season, Clara. It's always a busy season." We had met at a mutual friend's wedding 7 years earlier, in the middle of a rainstorm that had forced the reception indoors, and I had liked him immediately. His patience, his steadiness, the way he refilled people's glasses without being asked. We had dated for 2 years, married in the backyard of this very house, and spent the first 2 years of marriage painting walls and replacing fixtures and arguing pleasantly about whether the kitchen tiles should be white or cream. We settled on cream. I thought we were happy. I was certain enough of it that I had stopped asking the question with any real urgency. Eleanor Ashford, Mark's mother, had been in our lives from the very beginning, the way a persistent draft is in an old house. Always there, always finding the gaps, never quite enough to cause a serious problem, but never entirely ignorable either. She was 62, small and precise, with silver hair and a tight chignon, and hands that were perpetually busy, rearranging objects on tables, smoothing invisible wrinkles from tablecloths, touching the frames of photographs as though taking quiet inventory of what was hers and what was not. She drove a pearl-white sedan she kept immaculate, wore lavender perfume that arrived in a room slightly before she did, and had a way of phrasing criticism as concern that I had spent 3 years trying to navigate without losing my composure. She said things like, "Oh, Clara, those curtains. Aren't they a little dark for a room this size? But of course you know your own taste, darling. And I noticed the garden is looking tired. I could send someone. I just worry about the property value. And most often, we're family, Clara. There's nothing we can't work out between us as family." She said that last phrase so often it had begun to sound less like reassurance and more like a warning I hadn't yet learned to decode. Rosa had worked for the household since before the marriage, technically since my grandmother's final year, when the stairs had grown too steep for a woman of 81 to manage alone. She was in her late 60s, a compact, quiet woman from the Dominican Republic who had outlasted more family drama than any employee should have to witness, and who responded to all of it with the same expression, a slight, knowing tightening around the eyes, as though she had long ago concluded that the world was exactly as unreliable as expected, and found this more clarifying than distressing. She kept the house in quiet order, cooked meals that were simple but exactly right, and played the old upright piano on Thursday evenings. Always the same repertoire, a Chopin nocturne she had learned by ear decades ago, 2 hymns, and a song I had never been able to identify but had come to think of as simply Rosa's song. Slow, minor-keyed, full of something unspoken. The first time Eleanor asked about the deed, I told myself I had misheard her. It was a Sunday afternoon in early October, 3 months before that Thursday evening. We were sitting in the kitchen after lunch, Mark, Eleanor, and I, and the conversation had drifted in the comfortable, aimless way of post-meal Sundays, through the neighbor's renovation and rising property taxes, and whether the old oak at the back of the garden was threatening the fence line. And then Eleanor had set down her coffee cup precisely in the exact center of its saucer and said, "By the way, Clara, has the house been formally assessed recently? For insurance purposes?" I looked at her and said no, not since my grandmother's estate was settled 3 years ago. Eleanor nodded slowly, the way she always nodded when filing something away, and said, "Of course. I only ask because with properties of this age, the insurance situation can become complicated, especially if the ownership structure ever changes." There was a pause, not long, but weighted. I said, "The ownership structure isn't going to change." And Eleanor smiled her tight, precise smile and said, "Of course not, darling. I'm only thinking about worst-case scenarios. That's what mothers do." I let it go. I told myself it was the kind of thing she said, prodding at the edges without real intent, the conversational equivalent of testing door handles to see which ones were unlocked. Mark, across the table, had been entirely silent throughout the exchange. He had been tearing a piece of bread into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it. And when I caught his eye afterward, he gave me a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and asked whether anyone wanted more coffee. I watched him get up to refill the pot and thought, very deliberately, nothing is wrong. Everything is fine. And then I believed it, because it was easier than the alternative. The second time was harder to dismiss. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, and I had come home later than usual. A site meeting ran long. Traffic on the bridge added 20 minutes, and I was tired in the particular way of a day that had asked too much. I let myself in through the front door and stood for a moment in the entry hall, breathing in the smell of the house, wood polish and old stone and the faint ghost of dinner, and I heard voices in the sitting room. Mark and Eleanor, though I hadn't known she was coming that evening. I set my bag on the hall bench and started toward the kitchen, and I caught the last edge of what Eleanor was saying, drifting clearly through the doorway. It really would be cleaner if it were in both names. That's all I'm saying. It's not reasonable, in a marriage, for one person to hold the entire asset without... And then she must have heard my footsteps, because by the time I appeared in the doorway, they were discussing something entirely different. A cousin's engagement. A restaurant downtown. Mark had looked up and smiled. His smile was one beat too bright, held one count too long. "Hey, Long day? I said yes, went to the kitchen, stood at the counter while the kettle heated, and told myself I had heard things out of context, that Eleanor was making a general observation about marital finances, that Mark was simply glad to see me, and I was reading shadows into ordinary light. But I had not quite believed it. Not entirely. And that small, unresolved, not quite believing had settled into me like a splinter, too small to extract, too present to ignore. It was the second Thursday of January when everything changed. The evening had started with unremarkable grace. Mark had come home at his usual time, and we had eaten dinner at the kitchen table, Rosa's roast chicken with thyme and garlic, the last of the winter vegetables. And the conversation had been the easy domestic kind. My project downtown, his colleague changing departments, the question of servicing the boiler before spring. The kitchen smelled of butter and herbs and the warmth of a well-used stove, and the window above the sink had fogged from the heat, and for a few minutes I sat across from my husband in the amber light and felt with stubborn simplicity that this was my life and I was glad to have it. After dinner, Mark took his laptop to the study. Just for an hour, I have some figures to go over. And I settled onto the parlor sofa with my wine and the book I had been failing to finish for 6 weeks, and Rosa moved to the piano bench in the corner and began to play. I remember every detail of those 43 minutes with a strange, almost painful precision. The way you remember the last ordinary moments before something irreversible, because some part of you already knows they are the last ordinary moments and is trying to hold them still. The Chopin Nocturne first, the one I had heard so many times it had become part of the house's own sound, as natural as the creak of the third stair or the way the radiator knocked at 10 o'clock. Then 2 hymns I half knew from childhood. Then Rosa's song, slow and minor-keyed and full of something older than either of us. The clock on the mantel showed 8:47 when she lifted her hands from the keys and stood, pressing her palms to the small of her back the way she always did after sitting, looked at me with that expression I had come to read as her version of warmth, not demonstrative, just present, and said, "Good night, Miss Clara," and walked down the hall toward her room. The silence came in immediately, filling the shapes the music had occupied, and in that silence, complete, absolute, slightly too large for the room, I heard Mark's voice through the study wall, not words at first, just cadence, low, level, unhurried, the tone of a man discussing something he considered already decided, and then, without deciding to, without thinking about what I was doing, I stood up from the sofa and walked toward the study door, which stood 3 inches open, and I heard him say, with perfect clarity, "She doesn't need to know yet. Not until the paperwork is done." A pause. The faint tinny thread of Eleanor's voice from the phone speaker, too thin to make out words. And then Mark, again. "I told you. I'll handle Clara. Just make sure the notary is available before the 15th. I stood in the hallway. My wine glass was on the table in the other room. My book was open on the sofa cushion, face down on the page I had not managed to finish. The house was entirely quiet except for the distant knock of the radiator and the close sound of my own heartbeat, which had moved into my fingertips, the back of my throat, the soles of my feet against the cold hallway floor. Handle Clara. Make sure the notary is available before the 15th. The words refused to rearrange themselves into anything innocent, no matter how hard the part of me that still wanted ordinary life tried to make them do so. For a full minute, I stood perfectly still in that hallway, my back against the cold plaster, listening to Mark wrap up the call. A murmured yes, a brief yes, a final quiet "I'll take care of it." And then the soft sound of his laptop closing and his footsteps crossing the study floor. He appeared in the parlor doorway looking like himself, slightly tired, collar loosened, the expression of a man who has completed something unpleasant and is relieved to be done with it. He saw me on the sofa and smiled. "Good book?" I said it was fine. He said he was going to bed. Long day. Pressed a kiss to the top of my head the way he had done 1,000 times, and I sat entirely still and let him, and did not flinch, and did not let him see a single thing in my face that was not ordinary evening tiredness. I waited until I heard the shower running. Then I went to the study. The laptop was closed on the desk, but beside it, half tucked beneath a yellow legal pad as though someone had meant to conceal it and had not quite bothered, was a manila folder, thin, perhaps 10 pages, unlabeled. I stood in front of the desk, looking at the corner of it the way you look at a door you know will open onto something you cannot unsee. Then I picked it up. The first page was a draft quitclaim deed. My name was in the grantor field. Eleanor's name was in the grantee field. The property address was Heron Street. My address. The address on the title my grandmother had left me with those gray eyes and that quietly certain voice. The draft was not complete. Several fields were blank, the notary section empty. But the handwriting in the margins was Mark's. His neat architectural print that I had watched fill shopping lists and birthday cards in the early years now filled the margins of a document designed to remove me from my own home. He had written 3 things. Before the 15th, both SIGs needed, and underlined twice. Make sure C doesn't see this before it's ready. My hands did not shake. That was the thing I remembered afterward, and that I found, in some ways, the most frightening detail of that entire evening. My hands did not shake. Something in me had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a decision being made below the surface, the way water decides to freeze. I read the document. I read the margin notes twice. I replaced the folder exactly where I had found it, at the same angle, half tucked beneath the legal pad. I turned off the light. I went upstairs and got into bed and lay in the dark next to my sleeping husband and thought, I have until the 15th. I need to know everything before I move, and I need to be very, very careful. Rosa found me at the kitchen table at 6 the next morning, sitting with both hands around a mug of coffee I had not yet touched. She took in the scene from the doorway, the untouched coffee, whatever was happening in my face, and came to the table and sat across from me without being asked. She said, Miss Clara, how much do you want to know? I said, everything. She had known something was wrong for longer than I had. She said this without apology, in the same tone she used for dinner menus, and what she told me rearranged the entire picture into something both worse and more comprehensible than what I had assembled in the dark. Eleanor had come to the house twice in the 3 weeks prior, on weekday afternoons while I was at work, letting herself in with a key Mark kept on a hook in the garage. A key I had not known Eleanor could access. Both times she had gone to the study with Mark, and Rosa had moved through the house doing exactly what she always did, and heard enough to understand, in broad terms, what was being planned. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said, because you had a face those weeks, that was trying very hard to believe everything was fine. I didn't want to take that from you before you had something solid. Then she told me the rest. That Eleanor had been pressing for months to have the house transferred to her as a family asset, that Mark had resisted before being gradually worn down, and that the plan involved a quitclaim deed requiring only my signature. Rosa paused in the way that a sentence pauses before its most important word, and then said, I believe Mrs. Ashford thinks there is a document that already has your signature. Your grandmother's power of attorney from 2019. I sat with that for a moment. The coffee was cold in my hands. Then I stood up, poured it down the sink, rinsed the mug, set it on the rack, and said to Rosa, I need to make a phone call. Please don't tell Mark I was up early. My father picked up on the second ring. He was always an early riser. When I finished telling him everything, there were 3 full seconds of silence on the line, and then he said, Don't touch the folder again. Call Margaret Hess today, property attorney. Very good, I've sent you her number before. And tell her everything. Document everything and send it to an email address Mark doesn't know about. Do it this morning. He paused. I'm driving down tomorrow. I said he didn't have to. He said, I know, I'm going to. I photographed the folder that afternoon while Mark was at work, kneeling in front of his desk with my phone, my heart moving in that deep, deliberate way it had been moving since the night before. Not racing, but heavily, like something that has found its proper weight. I sent the photographs to Margaret Hess. I wrote down everything Rosa had told me. I created a private email account, a name Mark would not recognize, a password he would never guess. I had, in the space of 14 hours, moved from a woman lying paralyzed in the dark to a woman building a file. And the shift felt less like courage than recognition. I had done nothing wrong. This house was mine. And no one was going to change that while I sat on a sofa pretending not to see. The confrontation with Mark happened on a Saturday morning, 9 days before the 15th. I asked him to come downstairs for breakfast. He appeared in his weekend clothes, unhurried, entirely unsuspecting. I was standing at the kitchen table with a printed copy of the quitclaim deed, the photographs, and a brief letter from Margaret's office outlining what had been discovered and what would be filed that Monday. My father stood at the kitchen counter. I set the papers in front of Mark and said, very quietly, "Sit down." He looked at the papers before he looked at me. He sat down slowly. His face moved through recognition, then a flash of something that might have been calculation, and then, when he saw my father at the counter, still and watchful, a collapse into the expression of a man who has understood that the position he was holding is no longer tenable. He said, "Clara." His voice was wrong, the steadiness gone. I said nothing. He said, "It wasn't supposed to." I said, "I know what it was supposed to do." I read the margin notes. He tried for 20 minutes to explain. The explanation was long and sorry and full of the phrases I had known were coming. "She's my mother. I was going to talk her out of it. I never signed anything. I thought I had more time." I listened. My father listened. The kitchen was very quiet, the morning light flat and gray through the fogged window, the coffee growing cold on the counter. When Mark finished, I looked at him across the table and said, "You had her come into this house twice while I was at work. You wrote 'Make sure C doesn't see this' on a deed designed to give away a house my grandmother left me. Which part were you going to talk her out of?" He didn't answer. He looked at the table. The silence between us was the loudest thing I had heard in a very long time. Eleanor arrived 2 days later, Monday afternoon. She walked through the front door the way she always had, unhurried, proprietorial, already visually reorganizing the space, and stopped when she saw Margaret Hess at the kitchen table with an open folder and the expression of a woman paid by the hour, with no interest in wasting it. My father was there. Rosa was there. Mark was not. I had asked him to leave for the afternoon, and he had gone without argument, which was its own kind of answer. Eleanor looked at the room, at me, at Margaret, and smiled her precise smile. She said, "Clara, what is this?" I said, "Please sit down." Margaret placed the quitclaim deed in front of her, along with a copy of my grandmother's 2019 power of attorney and a legal opinion from a handwriting expert, confirming that signatures on a draft addendum in the folder were not consistent with my grandmother's known handwriting, and were, in the expert's professional judgment, produced by a single hand matching documents from Mark's desk. Eleanor looked at these items without touching them. Her face did not change. She said finally, "This is a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the family." I said, "Whose family?" Then she cried. She was very good at it. Controlled, calibrated, the tears arriving in the exact amount needed to destabilize a room. She said in her most suffering voice, "After everything I've done for the two of you, after everything I sacrificed, you sit here with a lawyer and treat me like a criminal over a piece of paper?" I said, "Eleanor, the paper is a forged document using a dead woman's signature, my grandmother's signature. If you would like to continue this conversation without Margaret, you are welcome to do that in a courtroom." The tears stopped. The precision returned to her face like a mask resettled, and she looked at me differently. For the first time, I thought, actually seeing me rather than the space she had always assumed she could eventually fill. She said, "You wouldn't." I said, "I already have." The filing is Monday morning. The silence that followed was the loudest room I had ever stood in. Eleanor picked up her bag. She left without another word. The click of her heels on the front walkway, the car door, the engine fading down Heron Street. My father put his hand briefly on my shoulder. Margaret said, "Monday morning." Rosa put the kettle on. The legal process was neither quick nor simple. Mark cooperated fully with the investigation and confirmed Eleanor had initiated the scheme and produced the forged addendum without his complete knowledge. Whether to believe that fully was a question I eventually decided belonged to him and his conscience rather than to me. Eleanor faced criminal charges for document fraud, which her attorney spent months negotiating into fines, probation, and the loss of her seat on the Community Foundation Board she had held for 12 years. A consequence she found more devastating than the legal penalties, which told me everything about what this had actually been. It had never been solely about money or property. It had been about control, the absolute conviction that her son's life and everything in it was hers to arrange. I kept the house. I am writing this on the porch, 9 months later, in early October. The oak at the back of the garden has turned, and the air smells of cold and leaf smoke, and the clarity that comes after something long and heavy has finally passed. Through the parlor window, faint and familiar, I can hear Rosa playing the opening bars of the Chopin Nocturne, and for a moment the sound and the season and the light on the old porch boards conspire into something that feels almost exactly like what my grandmother described when she talked about this place. Which is to say, it feels like a house that knows it belongs to someone who means to keep it. I lost something in all of this. The version of my marriage I had chosen to believe in, the version where the two bright smiles were just tiredness and the silences were just a busy season. That version was comfortable, and I understand now why I held it as long as I did. But some things can only be kept by refusing to see them clearly, and I had grown tired of the cost of that refusal. My grandmother left me this house, this piano, and something more important than either, the understanding that love is not the same thing as safety, and that knowing the difference is worth every single thing it costs you. The nocturne ends. The silence settles in around me, and I sit in it without flinching, and the October light holds steady on the old boards, and the house breathes, and it is enough. It has always been enough. I just had to be willing to fight for it.